The house once echoed with laughter and warmth, but for Linda, it had turned into a battlefield. At just 8 years old, she was caught in the crossfire of her father Mason's indifference and her stepmother Ruth's venomous disdain. Ruth's sharp words cut deeper than any blade, reducing Linda to a shadow of herself. Mason, once her protector, now seemed lost in his own world, blind to the cruelty unfolding under his roof. And yet, Linda held on to hope, a fragile thread that maybe, just maybe, her father would notice her pain and shield her once more. But life rarely follows the script we wish for, does it? Ruth's disdain wasn't subtle. It was a storm that raged openly. She saw Linda as an obstacle, a reminder of Mason's past life, a past she wanted erased. "She doesn't belong here," Ruth hissed one evening, her voice dripping with contempt as Mason sat silently in his chair. Linda overheard those words from behind the door, clutching her worn teddy bear as tears welled up in her eyes. Children shouldn't have to understand rejection so young, but Linda did. And Mason? He sat frozen, torn between guilt and fear of confrontation. Isn't it strange how silence can be louder than words? The days grew heavier for Linda, each one a little darker than the last. Ruth's hostility escalated from cold remarks to outright exclusion, meals served without a plate for Linda, family outings where she was left behind. Mason's absence in all of this was deafening. He wasn't cruel like Ruth. No, his crime was worse. He was indifferent. Linda began to wonder if love could simply vanish, or if it had ever been there at all. Deep down, though, she still clung to the idea that her father might wake up from this stupor and fight for her. But what happens when the person you rely on most becomes the one who lets you down? Ruth's patience had run its course, and her words grew sharper, more calculated. One evening, as Mason sat at the kitchen table nursing a glass of whiskey, Ruth leaned in with an icy glare. "It's her or me, Mason," she spat, her voice low but venomous. The ultimatum hung in the air, like a noose tightening around his neck. Mason froze, his hands trembling slightly as he avoided her gaze. Deep down, he knew this moment had been coming, but facing it was another matter entirely. How does one choose between the love of a child and the fear of losing everything else? Mason tried to reason with Ruth, though his voice lacked conviction. "She's just a child," he murmured, almost pleading. But Ruth wasn't swayed. "She's not my child," she snapped back, her tone cutting through him like a blade. "And if you want this marriage to work, she's got to go." Mason felt the weight of her demand pressing on his chest like an anchor dragging him under. He looked at Ruth so composed, so unyielding, and then thought of Linda's innocent face. Yet fear clouded his judgment. Fear of being alone, fear of starting over. Isn't it strange how fear can make cowards out of even the strongest people? Days turned into nights, and Mason wrestled with his conscience in silence. He avoided Linda's curious eyes and Ruth's impatient stares, retreating into himself as the walls of their home seemed to close in tighter. Ruth didn't let up. Every glance she gave him was a reminder that time was running out. Finally, one night, Mason broke under the pressure. "Fine," he whispered hoarsely to Ruth after hours of tense silence between them. "I'll take care of it." His words felt foreign to him, like they belonged to someone else entirely. But once spoken, they couldn't be taken back. And so began the unraveling of something sacred, a father's bond with his daughter. The moon hung low over the sea, its pale light casting an eerie glow on the waves. Mason rowed the small boat with Linda sitting quietly across from him, clutching her teddy bear. She had been so excited when he told her they were going on a special trip, just the two of them. "Is it a surprise, Daddy?" she had asked earlier, her eyes lighting up for the first time in weeks. Mason couldn't bring himself to answer, his throat tightening with every stroke of the oars. What kind of man betrays his own child? The question gnawed at him, but he pushed it aside as the shoreline disappeared into darkness. Linda hummed softly to herself, oblivious to the storm raging inside her father's mind. Mason's hands trembled as he brought the boat to a stop in the middle of the vast, endless sea. He couldn't look at her, couldn't bear to see the trust in her eyes. "Daddy?" she asked, sensing something was wrong. Her voice was small, uncertain, and it shattered what little resolve Mason had left. But Ruth's voice echoed in his head, drowning out everything else. "She's got to go." He stood abruptly, his movements jerky and unnatural. "I'm sorry," he choked out, his voice barely audible over the lapping waves. Before Linda could react, Mason reached for her and lifted her trembling body over the edge of the boat. "No, Daddy, please." She screamed, clutching at him with all her might as tears streamed down her face. But Mason's guilt-fueled desperation made him deaf to her cries. With one final push, he let go and Linda plunged into the icy water below. For a moment, there was silence. Then came the splashing and gasping as she struggled against the waves, her small arms flailing in panic. Mason sat frozen in the boat, paralyzed by what he had done. But something incredible was about to happen, something that would change both their lives forever. The sea was merciless, its cold embrace pulling Linda under as she struggled to stay afloat. Her cries for help were swallowed by the vast emptiness around her. She kicked and thrashed, her tiny body fighting against the weight of the water, dragging her down. Just when it seemed the battle was lost, a faint light appeared in the distance, a flicker of hope in the darkness. Joe, a fisherman who had spent years navigating these waters, spotted the child's desperate struggle from his small boat. His instincts kicked in immediately. "Hold on, kid," he shouted into the night, his voice cutting through the roar of the waves. Joe's boat sliced through the water as he worked quickly to reach her. He leaned over the edge, his strong hands plunging into the icy depths to pull Linda aboard. She was limp, shivering violently, her lips blue from the cold. "You're safe now," Joe murmured, wrapping her in an old blanket he kept for emergencies. His weathered face softened as he looked at her, this fragile little girl who had no business being out here alone. What kind of monster would leave a child like this? He muttered under his breath, his heart aching for answers he didn't yet have. But for now, all that mattered was keeping her alive. Back at Joe's modest home on the edge of a quiet fishing village, Linda stirred awake by the warmth of a crackling fire. Her wide eyes darted around the unfamiliar room before landing on Joe, who sat nearby with a cup of tea in hand. "Where's my daddy?" she whispered hoarsely, her voice barely audible. Joe hesitated, unsure how to respond. "We'll talk about that later," he said gently, brushing a strand of wet hair from her face. "Right now, you just need to rest." Linda clung to the blanket tightly, her small frame trembling not just from the cold, but from everything she had endured. Little did she know that this stranger would become her lifeline in ways she couldn't yet imagine. Joe's home was simple, a small wooden cottage that smelled of salt and fish, but to Linda, it felt like a sanctuary. For the first time in what felt like forever, she wasn't afraid. Joe moved around the house with a quiet care, bringing her warm soup and tucking her into a cozy bed. He didn't ask questions, not yet. He could see the weight she carried in her eyes, and he knew that healing couldn't be rushed. "You're safe here," he said softly one evening as he placed a steaming bowl in front of her. Linda didn't respond, but for the first time, she ate without hesitation. Sometimes kindness doesn't need words, it just needs time. Days turned into weeks, and little by little, Linda began to trust Joe. She'd sit by the window, watching him mend his fishing nets or prepare his boat for the day's work. Occasionally, he'd catch her watching and flash her a warm smile. "You know," he said one afternoon as he sat beside her, The sea has a way of taking things from us, but it also gives back. Linda tilted her head, curious but silent. Joe chuckled softly. You don't have to say anything yet, he added. Just know that whatever you're feeling, it's okay. His words settled over her like a blanket, offering a comfort she hadn't felt in years. The village soon took notice of the quiet little girl who had appeared at Joe's side. The neighbors were kind, bringing fresh bread or small gifts to make her feel welcome, but they didn't pry. Linda found solace in their gentle presence and in the rhythm of life by the sea. Slowly, she began to open up, not with words but with small gestures, helping Joe clean fish or laughing softly when he told one of his silly jokes. Each day brought a tiny piece of her back to life. And though the scars of betrayal still lingered deep within her, something new was beginning to grow: hope. One quiet evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in hues of orange and pink, Joe sat on the porch with Linda. The sound of waves lapping against the shore filled the silence between them. Linda had grown more comfortable in Joe's presence, but she still carried an unspoken sadness that weighed heavy in the air. Joe sighed deeply, staring out at the endless expanse of water. You know, he began, his voice low and steady, I had a daughter once. Linda turned to him, her small face curious but cautious. What happened to her? She asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Joe hesitated, his weathered hands gripping the arms of his chair. She was about your age, he said finally, his voice tinged with a sorrow that time hadn't erased. One day, we were out at sea, and there was an accident. A storm came out of nowhere. He paused, his throat tightening as memories flooded back. I tried to save her, but the sea took her from me. His words hung in the air like a heavy fog. Linda's eyes widened as she absorbed his story, feeling an unexpected connection to this man who had saved her life. I'm so sorry, she murmured, her small hand reaching out to touch his arm. Joe gave her a faint smile, though his eyes glistened with unshed tears. It's okay, he said after a moment. You remind me of her in some ways stronger than you think you are. Linda looked down at her lap, unsure how to respond but feeling a warmth in her chest that she hadn't felt in a long time. For the first time since being pulled from the sea, she felt like someone truly understood her pain. Joe leaned forward slightly and added, sometimes life takes things from us that we'll never get back. But it also gives us second chances if we're willing to take them. His words lingered in Linda's mind long after the sun disappeared below the horizon. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, the kind where the village bustled quietly with life, fishermen hauling in their nets, children laughing by the shore. Linda was helping Joe sort through a fresh catch when she froze. Standing at the edge of the dock was a man she never thought she'd see again, Mason. Her heart dropped, and her hands trembled as she clutched a fish tighter than necessary. Joe followed her gaze, his brows furrowing as he took in the disheveled figure of Mason. Who's that? Joe asked gently, though he already suspected the answer. Linda didn't reply. Her silence said everything. Mason looked different, older, more worn, as if the weight of his guilt had aged him overnight. His eyes searched desperately until they landed on Linda. Linda, he called out, his voice cracking like brittle glass. She flinched at the sound of his voice, her body stiffening as memories of that night came rushing back. Joe stepped protectively in front of her, his presence steady and grounding. What do you want? Joe asked firmly, his tone leaving no room for nonsense. Mason hesitated, his shoulders slumping under the burden of his shame. I came to see my daughter, he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the sound of the waves. Linda's chest tightened as anger and pain bubbled to the surface. She stepped out from behind Joe, her small frame trembling but defiant. You left me, she said, her voice sharp and filled with hurt. "You threw me away like I didn't matter." Mason's face crumpled as tears streamed down his cheeks. "I know," he whispered hoarsely, falling to his knees on the dock. "I was a coward. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I had to try." Linda stared at him, her emotions swirling like a storm inside her: anger, sadness, confusion. She didn't know what to say or feel, but one thing was certain: this wasn't over yet. Linda couldn't sleep that night. Mason's face, broken and tear-streaked, haunted her every thought. She wanted to hate him, to hold on to the anger that had kept her strong all this time. But deep down, a small voice whispered something she didn't want to hear. What if forgiving him could set you free? Sitting by the window of Joe's cottage, she watched the moonlight ripple across the sea. Joe joined her quietly, his presence steady as always. "You don't have to decide right away," he said, handing her a mug of warm tea. "But holding on to pain, it's like carrying a heavy net full of stones. It only weighs you down." Linda looked up at him, her eyes filled with questions. "But why should I forgive him?" she asked, her voice trembling. "He didn't care about me. He threw me away." Joe sighed deeply, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Forgiveness isn't about saying what he did was okay," he explained gently. "It's about taking back your power, choosing not to let his mistakes control your life anymore." He paused, letting his words sink in. "It's not for him, Linda. It's for you." Linda stared into her tea, the warmth seeping into her hands as she wrestled with the weight of his words. Could she really let go of the anger that had been her shield? The next morning, Mason was still in the village, sitting alone on the dock where he had first appeared. He looked like a man who had nowhere else to go. Linda approached cautiously, her steps hesitant but deliberate. She stood before him in silence for what felt like an eternity before finally speaking. "Why now?" she asked, her voice steady but laced with pain. Mason looked up at her, his eyes red and swollen. "Because I couldn't live with myself anymore," he admitted. "Every day since that night has been a nightmare. I know I can't undo what I did, but I want to try to make it right if you'll let me." Linda didn't respond immediately. Instead, she turned and walked away, leaving Mason with his guilt and herself with a decision that would change everything. The days that followed were heavy with silence. Linda avoided Mason, her heart a battlefield of conflicting emotions. She spent hours sitting by the shore, watching the waves crash against the rocks, as if the sea could offer her answers. Joe didn't push her. He knew this was a journey she had to take on her own. But one evening, as they sat together by the fire, she finally spoke. "What if I forgive him, and it doesn't change anything?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Joe leaned back in his chair, his eyes thoughtful. "Forgiveness isn't about changing him," he said gently. "It's about freeing yourself from what he did to you. You don't have to carry his mistakes anymore." Linda mulled over Joe's words long into the night. She thought about the anger she had held onto for so long. It had been her armor, her way of surviving. But now it felt like a weight she couldn't bear anymore. The next morning, she walked to the dock where Mason sat every day, waiting for her. He looked up as she approached, his expression a mixture of hope and dread. "I've thought about what you said," Linda began, her voice steady but soft. "And I've decided. I'm going to forgive you." Mason's breath caught in his throat, tears welling up in his eyes. But before he could speak, Linda raised a hand to stop him. "Not for you," she added firmly. "For me." Mason nodded, his face crumpling as he wept openly. He didn't try to justify himself or beg for more than she was willing to give. He simply said, "Thank you." Linda felt an unexpected lightness in her chest as she walked away from the dock that day. Forgiving Mason didn't erase what he had done or make everything okay, but it gave her something more valuable: peace. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt like she could breathe again. And though the road ahead would still be difficult, Linda knew she had taken the first step toward healing, not just for herself, but for the life she wanted to build moving forward. The village became a place of quiet transformation for Linda, Mason, and Joe. Though the scars of the past still lingered, they began to find a rhythm together, a fragile but growing bond that surprised even Linda. Mason, determined to prove himself worthy of her forgiveness, stayed in the village and worked tirelessly alongside Joe. He mended nets, hauled in catches, and helped with chores around the cottage. It wasn't about earning her love back. He knew that might never happen. It was about showing her, through action, that he was no longer the man who had abandoned her. And slowly, Linda began to see glimpses of the father she had once adored. Joe became the glue that held them together, his steady presence guiding both Linda and Mason through their uncharted waters. He taught Mason how to navigate the sea and showed Linda how to mend nets with nimble fingers. "The sea has a way of teaching us patience," Joe would often say, his voice calm and reassuring. "It doesn't give you what you want right away. You have to work for it." Those words stuck with Linda as she watched her father try, fail, and try again. She didn't trust him completely yet, but she couldn't deny that he was trying. And maybe that was enough for now. Life in the village wasn't perfect, but it was real. The three of them formed an unlikely family, one built not on perfection, but on resilience and effort. Linda found joy in small things, helping Joe cook dinner, laughing at Mason's clumsy attempts to repair a boat, or simply feeling the sun on her face as she played by the shore. The pain of her past didn't disappear overnight, but it no longer defined her. She was learning that healing wasn't about forgetting, it was about finding new ways to live despite the hurt. And as she watched Mason and Joe work side by side one evening, she realized something. Sometimes broken pieces can come together to create something entirely new. Forgiveness, Linda realized, wasn't a single act, it was a journey. Some days, she felt the sting of Mason's betrayal as if it had happened yesterday. Other days, she caught herself laughing at his awkward attempts to win her trust back, and the pain seemed to loosen its grip. Joe's words echoed in her mind often. "Forgiveness isn't about them, it's about you by choosing to forgive." She had opened a door she didn't even know existed. It wasn't easy, but it was freeing. And in that freedom, she found something she hadn't felt in years: peace. Mason, too, was transformed by the power of forgiveness. Though he still carried the weight of his guilt, Linda's decision to forgive him gave him a chance to rebuild not just his relationship with her, but also himself. He worked tirelessly to be a better man, not because he expected anything in return, but because he wanted to be someone worthy of the second chance he'd been given. "I'll never stop trying," he told Linda one evening as they sat by the fire. She didn't respond with words, but leaned her head against his shoulder, a small gesture that spoke volumes. Joe watched the two of them with quiet pride. He had lost his own daughter to the sea, but in Linda and Mason, he found a new purpose, a chance to guide others through their pain and toward healing. "Life doesn't give us what we expect," he said one evening as they all sat together, watching the sun dip below the horizon. "But it has a funny way of giving us what we need if we're willing to see it." Linda smiled softly at his words, her heart lighter than it had been in years. The journey hadn't been easy, but it had taught them all that forgiveness wasn't just about letting go, it was about making room for something new to grow. Linda's story is a testament to the resilience of the human heart and the transformative power of forgiveness. What began as a tale of betrayal and despair became a journey of healing, redemption, and unexpected love. Through her pain, Linda discovered that forgiveness wasn't about excusing the past, it was about reclaiming her future. Mason learned that while regret can weigh you down, the courage to change can lift you back up. And Joe, who had lost so much, found a new purpose in helping others rebuild what was broken. Together, they proved that even the most shattered relationships can be pieced back together with patience, effort, and empathy. But what about you? What burdens are you carrying that weigh down your heart? Is there someone you need to forgive not for their sake, but for your own? Or perhaps you're the one seeking forgiveness, unsure if you'll ever deserve it. Life isn't perfect. It's messy and unpredictable, just like the sea. But within that chaos lies the opportunity for growth, connection, and healing. The question is, are you willing to take that first step? Are you ready to let go of what holds you back and make room for something new to grow? If this story moved you or made you reflect on your own life, don't keep it to yourself. Subscribe to the channel and activate notifications so we can continue exploring these powerful lessons together. There's so much more to learn, and your journey doesn't end here. It's only just beginning. Let's keep growing, one story at a time.